Hey everyone, this is Eric, and welcome back to Punchboard Pagoda. Today I'm going to be talking about curriculum design and how we as coaches and athletes can look at ways to improve our gym's curriculum. I'm going to be talking mostly about jiu-jitsu curriculum specifically, and doing an analysis of a curriculum I personally made for a kids program. But the main focus of this episode is less about specific curriculum and technique focus and that sort of design, and more about the important educational concepts and terms and ideas that we need to keep in mind when it comes to designing a strong and solid curriculum. This is a thing I think that is quite important and not really discussed, and so I want to begin that discussion here. Now, currently, I have this written out as a single episode, but there may be a few more episodes I can make on this topic or related topics down the line, so keep that in mind that this might end up becoming a series. Before we get into the deeper focus of today's episode, I should probably explain how and why I think I have some role to play in this conversation and why I'm taking it upon myself to begin this discussion. I've been doing jiu-jitsu since 2008. I took a 4-year break after college in 2011, but I came back in 2016. So I've been doing it for the better part of a decade, and it's one of the sports where there's an ever-evolving and ever-changing meta, which in turn signals that there is a need for knowledge to be generated, passed along, and improved upon. In addition, I'm actually in the process of working on my PhD thesis in educational research, so it's not very surprising to know that I'm quite interested in the educational aspects and similar topics when it comes to jiu-jitsu. And at Punchboard Pagoda, I really like to blend the two topics of education and jiu-jitsu, and you can see that in some of my previously written work that I've published. Now, I've taken MMA and jiu-jitsu and talked about them from the lens of an educator, as I think that those are areas that are often not commonly brought up or discussed, and it's just something that's quite interesting to me. So today is more of a expansion of that feeling of, I really want to talk about these things. I really feel like this sort of information is worth sharing. One of the most important things you can find in the jiu-jitsu landscape is the need for and management of a solid curriculum for a gym. This is something I have personally observed, as well as my friends and training partners expressing in our conversations at the gym and online. This specific point is often mentioned as one of the more important indicators that you've found a good coach. Do they have a curriculum, or do they just wing it after watching a really quick clip on YouTube or Instagram? Those are the big differences. And to me, having a really solid, or at least a structured curriculum is a sign that the coach takes their job seriously. Now, I've had both kinds of coaches, and I've been in both sort of learning environments where the coaches are either really prepared or underprepared. And from my own experience, someone taking the time to figure out a curriculum is going to be far better to learn jiu-jitsu from, not just in terms of the technical knowledge, but the holistic development of your jiu-jitsu and athletic abilities. Which brings me into today's episode. While I was in grad school, I was tasked with writing a relatively short academic paper that analyzed a curriculum in any setting I chose, and looking at what the academic outcomes were, as well as identifying what sort of misalignments in the curriculum occurred. Now, given I had relatively mixed experiences as an educator, I decided to lean on my jiu-jitsu experiences for a moment, rather than those from my teaching career, simply because I just didn't want to talk about the negative aspects of my work experience. This was mostly because I had also noticed that there wasn't really ever any academic discussion surrounding jiu-jitsu and education. So I wanted to try to get the ball rolling a bit and explore whether that would be of interest or value in discussing both in the educational space as well as the jiu-jitsu space. That leads us to today. I took a recent look at the papers and thought that they'd be worth discussing. Summaries of the main points I was bringing up in these papers were published in a few of my articles I wrote a few years ago. So this isn't exactly new material that I'm going over, but it's worth going over in a little bit more depth than I did previously. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not going to be a step-by-step breakdown of how to make a curriculum. Instead, the focus here is on the overarching approach and key concepts to designing a well-rounded curriculum. This is a very academically focused discussion, and more so sits in the realm of heady concepts that govern educational practices and behaviors, more so than just jiu-jitsu itself or how to be a good coach. To that last point, though, these sort of discussions are how I think coaches can improve their skills. But again, I'm focusing more on the educational skills rather than simply how to teach someone to do a flying go-go plata. So in short, this is the stuff you need to know to make sure your curriculum is achieving what you want it to achieve and how to assess your curriculum analytically, critically, and effectively. This analysis we're going to go through specifically looks at the kids jiu-jitsu program I had to design and conduct while I was teaching a kids jiu-jitsu program in South Korea. So without wasting too much more time, let's get into it. So here's the quick and simple background to help set the stage so you understand the purpose and reason for the curriculum that we're discussing and analyzing today. I was training at the main Alliance affiliated gym in South Korea, where I also happened to be the only non-Korean. For the most part, there were other non-Koreans who would show up and train it for a bit and then move on, but I was pretty much there from 2018 to 2023 consistently. In 2019, I was approached and took on the job of creating and conducting a 16-week jiu-jitsu program for kids aged 5 to 10. The basic guidelines were that these kids would have no prior experience with jiu-jitsu and also that there was no current or available curriculum I could use. To that latter point, this branch of Alliance did not have a prior kids program to build a curriculum off of. And also, while Alliance does have their own internal curriculum, at the time I did not have access to it, so I was left designing my curriculum by myself. Before we began the program, we sat down and figured out what the main learning goals were for the program. They were as follows. Teach basic jiu-jitsu techniques, help students develop body control and body motor mechanics, foster teamwork and discipline, and the last one, which would be the biggest challenge, teach the classes in English to a bunch of non-English speaking kids to support their language learning and encourage English development and usage. South Korea has English as a mandatory language. However, not all South Koreans are proficient or readily use their language skills on a regular basis. So the goal here was to help support and further the language development that the students were receiving from their public schools by exposing them to English in a new environment. This is not too uncommon in after-school academies or programs that most kids enroll in South Korea, and so that was why I, the lone non-Korean at my gym, was tasked with heading up the program. To say that this was a challenging task is a bit of an understatement. Now, before we start, I think it's important to clarify some important terminology. When I say curriculum, I'm not just simply meaning the list of things you teach. Academic researchers Gabi and Walker explain that a curriculum is the course's contents being learned by the student and being taught by the instructor. They state that this summarization is quite narrow in view and that there is much more nuance and breadth to the concept of what curriculum is than what most people commonly assume. To further this, researchers Webster and Ryan also stated in 2019 that there are multiple types of curriculum, and these are most typically seen as the intended curriculum, the enacted curriculum, the experienced curriculum, the null curriculum, the hidden curriculum, the learned curriculum, and the assessed curriculum. For the purposes of this episode, where we're analyzing the curriculum I designed, we're going to focus on intended curriculum, enacted curriculum, and experienced. That is not to say that the other forms are not necessary, but once we start talking about just those three and how they interrelate, you'll kind of start to realize how thick into the weeds we can get and how deep that conversation can go. And today is more of a surface level discussion. To simply describe these types of curriculum, I think it's important to put them in the context of a jiu-jitsu setting. The intended curriculum takes the form of the specific learning outcomes, aka what it is you want your student to know at the end of a session. This in jiu-jitsu terms are typically the techniques or system of techniques or body positions and pressure and that sort of stuff that you can teach in a set order or chain so that your student can repeat them while sparring or competing. So to simplify it, the intended curriculum is what you want your student to learn. Next, the enacted curriculum is what is being taught by the educator or coach during the period of learning. This is less about any specific topics or techniques and more how those topics are being taught and that transfer of knowledge between the teacher and the student. Enacted curriculum is quite closely linked to pedagogical approaches, and so if you're aware of at least what pedagogy is, then you're already about halfway there to understanding this term. Again, enacted curriculum is simply what is being taught and how it is being taught. And finally, we have the experience curriculum. This is probably the biggest of the three to be mindful of. Experience curriculum is described as being what is actually experienced by the student as they engage with what is being taught. This term applies regardless if the experience is happening in a planned or unintended manner. When we look at this through the lens of jiu-jitsu, you can see it in the form of your students developing a sense of understanding on timing, positional placement of body parts, knowledge when to or not to apply pressure, and so forth, as they're completing a technique that you've already taught them. In addition, this is also applied to the psychological state of the learner. In the context of jiu-jitsu, this can be seen when a student is able to maintain focus during a competition after the experiences of sparring and competing in the gym over time, as compared to when they first start, where they may lose focus, they may lose awareness of where their body is. So to simplify this, experience curriculum is ultimately what did the student take away from the lesson? So we have our three curriculums: intended, what we're trying to teach; enacted, what and how we are teaching the topic; and experienced, what is gained and retained by the student. All of this is to say that curriculum, as a concept, is far more nuanced than what you may initially think it is. Curriculums are an entire ecosystem of learning where these various parts all interact and affect each other in nuanced and subtle ways. Now that we have these three terms laid out, let's dive a bit deeper into the curriculum program that I designed and how these curriculum types come into play. In the program I created and taught at Alliance Korea, the newly created intended curriculum was planned to focus on in-person training sessions for 2 hours a week over the course of a 16-week-long schedule that would then repeat itself. The course aims were shaped by what the head coach at Alliance Korea viewed as the base standards for jiu-jitsu for kids to learn. So the program was designed along normative needs, as described by Morrison et al., by using the established IBJJF requirements for belt promotion for the children's divisions, as well as the standards outlined by Alliance Jiu-Jitsu itself on their webpage. Having autonomy in the design, I was allowed to utilize external curriculums from other children's programs. In this case, I heavily relied on the Gracie University Bullyproof program, which I think is a good program in general, but there are some minor grievances I have with it that I won't really get into today. In addition, I went out and got personal guidance through conversations with other coaches at different gyms around the world, some in the US, some in Canada, some in South Korea, some in Australia. And mostly these were my friends who I just knew from jiu-jitsu, and we were able to exchange info on how to teach kids classes quite well. As the sole educator, it was my responsibility to track and maintain an understanding of the intended curriculum and effectively perform it during each lesson. Unbeknownst to me at the time, my preparation work for each of the training sessions we had for the whole program followed a curriculum strategy framework as described by researchers Sharon and Drake back in 2009. According to their framework, there are 3 phases of curriculum strategy: reading, evaluating, and adapting. The first stage, reading, comes when the instructor reviews written documents and goals as an overview and looks for details prior to instruction and also during instruction. The evaluation stage comes when an instructor focuses on the target audience's needs when determining if the curriculum they designed or have in front of them is appropriate. And the third stage, adapting, occurs when the instructor creates, replaces, or even omits components of the curriculum during the instruction. So this can be seen when, prior to each of my jiu-jitsu classes, I would go over and review the written curriculum I had to make sure I knew what the goals for the day were, as well as what were the teaching methods I was planning on using for that lesson. Then I would determine which of the techniques being focused on would be most suitable using the existing knowledge I had from observing and assessing my students' development and skills. Finally, I would then adapt the curriculum for the day by typically adding additional steps to the learning process to make sure there's a more clear line of knowledge established, as well as clarifying any confusion that the students had. This can be seen when I would repeat the technique being taught, but add a little bit more information or detail to it so as any consistently observed mistakes could be corrected or removed from the students' attempts to execute the technique I'm teaching them. Additionally, in the course of conducting the class, it was also unknown to me that the existence of curriculum potential existed and was also being explored. This is a concept described by Ben Peretz back in the 90s, where there are a range of possibilities for learning that are inherent in the curriculum. So, curriculum potential refers to the opportunities of learning that a particular curriculum provides for students so that they can learn and grow. This potential can be improved or maximized by designing the curriculum to meet the needs and interests of the students, and by using a variety of teaching methods and assessment strategies to promote student engagement and participation. Due to the large language barrier that existed between the students and myself, there was more curriculum potential that existed within the context of just the jiu-jitsu training as opposed to the English language learning. These jiu-jitsu specific examples came in the form of the techniques and drills as they provided opportunities for the students to develop physical strength, flexibility, balance, and coordination, as well as mental focus. And when it came to the light sparring, that was also part of the curriculum so as to develop technique application against a resisting partner. It allowed the students to apply the learned techniques in a dynamic and more realistic or real-world context, and to expand and approach the use of strategic timing to apply the technique. So this in turn benefited students when it came to the concept of the experience curriculum. Now that we've gotten all this initial discussion out of the way, we can take a look at how these three curriculums, intended, enacted, and experience, align and misalign, and what, in my program in particular, did and did not work to this end. When we look at curriculum, it's important to assess the alignment of goals, as stated in the intended curriculum, to what is actually being taught in the enacted curriculum. Educational researcher Schubert in 2008 stated that there are opportunities for misalignment to occur in the intended-enacted curriculum relationship. Specifically, Schubert mentions that the differences in the two forms of curriculum can come from teacher misunderstanding in the form of reading of the curriculum, evaluating the curriculum, or even adapting the curriculum. This actually supports what Sharon and Drake said in 2009 in their view of the intended-enacted curriculum relationship, wherein educators can view, evaluate, or adapt a curriculum differently depending on a variety of factors relating to the individual teacher. In the case of the curriculum I designed, there were alignments and misalignments in different areas. One such area of alignment was that the instruction of the techniques did follow the intended curriculum and its overall plan and approach to teaching technique sequences. So, as an example, the body mechanic known as shrimping was taught as a basic movement and a key necessity for the learners to develop. And after the first lesson of being exposed to it, the children in my class were able to completely and competently perform the motion when necessary. However, looking at the relationship, a notable misalignment between my intended and enacted curriculum came in the form of the evaluation of the curriculum. Specifically, it was determined that the pacing I had set up, where there was a rapid introduction of certain body mechanic techniques, was too fast, and that the students in my class actually needed more time to develop proper balance and body control. So to resolve this, it became necessary for me to adapt the curriculum in its enactment to allow for more time to work on nuances of the specific body mechanic motions and provide additional time for technique drilling rather than emphasizing sparring. Using the curriculum strategy framework I mentioned earlier, this meant that the creation of new components of the curriculum were necessary, as well as omitting sections to fit within the allotted practice time for each lesson, as well as within the total course's program length. Certain parts had to be moved around to fit that 16-week period. The results of this adaptation to the curriculum allowed the learners to get a better sense of the key foundational mechanics and techniques that would then allow them to progress further with minimal impact later on in their development, rather than going down a path of poor technique performance and struggling to adjust at a later point. Essentially, I was able to adjust early enough to guide my students onto the right path that I wanted them to go down, rather than adjusting at a later point where those adjustments would have been harder. Another major challenge with this alignment relationship was the issue of language barriers existing between myself and my students. Now, as a native English speaker, one of the intended focuses of the program was to do all my instruction in English to allow for exposure of the English language to non-English speaking learners. This goal was mostly met, but there were numerous instances of the learners clearly struggling to understand the instructions and directions that were given in English due to their own limited capacities and capabilities with the language. This would often cause misalignments in understanding the techniques as effectively as a native English speaker could. So it became necessary to replace certain components within the intended curriculum, specifically terminology related to jiu-jitsu, with more simplified and easier to comprehend terms. So an example of this is, rather than saying, use your C grips, the instruction had to be adjusted, and the term C grips was simply replaced with Lego hands. This was a concept that was more readily familiar to the learners than the intended curriculum assumed, since C grips is not very common in their understanding, whereas Lego hands is something that they probably would have been exposed to. So some adjustment and adaptation was necessary. The misalignment due to the language barrier does not solely exist in the realm of the intended and enacted curriculum relationship. It can also be seen in the enacted and experienced curriculum relationship. This second relationship refers to the degree in which what is actually taught and learned aligning with the experiences and understanding of the curriculum by the student. That language barrier I mentioned is a good example of this misalignment. As seen in the implementation of the curriculum, instructions were in a language that the children did not fully comprehend. So, at times, they struggled to understand and execute techniques effectively. There was a clear lack of effective comprehension on specific body movements and body mechanics to perform the techniques properly that caused the children to struggle with executing them. Another example of a misalignment was that some of the techniques appeared to be too difficult for some of the learners, specifically the younger ones, to properly perform them, likely due to a lack of body control and awareness of their body movements. There was visible frustration shown by the students when, while attempting to do a technique, they struggled, that eventually caused them to forego or skip out on the proper execution and instead performed a variation of the technique that ultimately ignored all key foundational methods that were part of the instruction. So, for example, rather than being tight with their body position, they were quite loose and open, which eventually would allow a more skilled opponent to escape the technique. Despite these misalignments, there were also examples of proper alignment in this relationship between the enacted and experienced curriculums. This mostly came in the form of the students during both sparring sessions and in competitions, being able to perform several of the techniques that they had been taught and had received instruction on. There was also alignment between the stated goals of the program when the students consistently showed positive sportsmanship and positive behavior while at competitions by being respectful to their opponents, whether they won or lost the match. This indicates that there was a successful alignment between the enacted curriculum and the experienced curriculum, as the students ultimately portrayed a competent understandings of the key lessons taught to them during the course of the program. Due to the existence of these misalignments across both relationships, it's important to also analyze and assess what alternatives could be used to adjust the overall curriculum to ensure that there's no further deviation or misalignments. One solution to resolve any issues with alignment can come in the form of a total reassessment and rewriting of the intended curriculum. Due to the nature of the program being designed with only guidelines given from a head coach, as well as rough guidelines or learning outcomes as stated by Alliance's main website, further detailed instruction on what is or is not necessary would have been an ideal starting point. Allowing for more experienced instructors to guide the creation of the curriculum could have negated any of the issues in introducing complicated concepts too early. This in turn may have led to more focus on core fundamentals and development of those associated techniques that would have aided in the student's ability to conduct body mechanics more efficiently. Furthermore, it would have allowed for a more refined approach towards teaching, as the head instructor has typically more experience instructing jiu-jitsu, whereas in my case, I only had a limited amount of experience and mostly drew from my career as a English as a second language teacher rather than a jiu-jitsu coach. In addition to this, the choice of focusing on instruction being solely in English could have also been omitted from the curriculum to allow for a better and clearer instruction to the students. There were several issues with the curriculum misalignment, drawing from the reality that there was a large language barrier existing between myself, the educator, and the students. There is also an argument to be made that emphasis on the curriculum not being about jiu-jitsu techniques exactly, but focusing more on body movement and body mechanic exercises instead. Following the guidelines offered by the Canadian nonprofit organization Sport for Life, using their 2023 pamphlet on long-term athletic development of children, rather than focusing on highly technical mechanics associated solely within the sport of jiu-jitsu, emphasis could have been placed on related body motions and control that were most appropriate for children in the specific age ranges I was teaching. As there were issues with misalignment due to the students struggling to effectively use jiu-jitsu techniques, the focus on body mechanics and body motion control would have actually better allowed for better competency in jiu-jitsu at a later point in their development. In addition, allowing for a division to exist, splitting the classes up from a singular class covering a wide range of 5 to 10-year-olds would also help in this effort and allow for sparring to be between opponents and participants that are of equal size and strength, so as not to allow for room for discouragement from the smaller students who clearly struggle against a much older and much larger opponent. So in summary, the process of implementing a kids jiu-jitsu program at this gym required a wide degree of theories and concepts. As the educator and curriculum author, it was required of me to apply these theories and stratagems efficiently and effectively, and be aware of the factors, areas, and remedies for any misalignments in the instruction and the internalization of the curriculum. While perfect alignment across all components of a curriculum is ideal, practically speaking, that sort of goal is not attainable due to a variety of uncontrollable factors and variables. So I hope that this whole discussion has helped clarify some of the often vague or unseen factors in how to improve a curriculum. The misalignments I've talked about of the various curriculum types are, frankly, a never-ending struggle to manage. There simply is no such thing as perfect alignment across all of these curriculum relationships, which means that curriculums are always in a state of needing analysis, adjustment, execution, and then repeating it all over again. So that's all for this episode. I would like to thank you for taking the time and sticking through this pretty dry and analytical view of jiu-jitsu. If you want to read more of my ad hoc discussions on education or jiu-jitsu, or just my general sarcasm, you can follow me on Blue Sky. I'm at Rolling With Words. And if you enjoy our podcast, please remember to like it on whatever platform you are listening to it on, as that helps us with algorithmic stuff that apparently determines how frequently we will randomly pop up on someone's feed. You can also share our work directly with your friends if you want. Both our written and audio content is available by visiting us at fightis.land. That's FIGHTIS.LAND. Thank you, and see you next time.